Welcome everyone to this webinar about elections in a pandemic. This is the second installment in our webinar series, following the event on May the 20th about the perspective from election management bodies. I'm Magnus. I'm with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES. We're a non-profit, non-governmental organization which supports electoral processes broadly defined across the globe. And we have been assisting elections in Europe since the late 1980s. I'm the IFES Senior Political Finance Advisor and Director of the IFES Regional Europe Office, which is here in Prague. We are hosting this webinar. This event is part of a larger USA-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices and is made possible by the generous support of the American people. The topic for today's webinar is election-related disinformation. There is as such nothing new about disinformation, but the current pandemic has led to a massive increase in false information affecting many areas of our democratic systems. In fact, we are seeing an infodemic, a mass of information, some accurate, a lot not, that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. So in this webinar, we will discuss how, for example, election management bodies, civil society organizations, and media can address problems of viral misinformation, hate speech, and the use of disinformation by domestic and foreign actors to impact the information environments around COVID-19, which has direct implications for electoral integrity and trust in the democratic process. With us in this webinar, we have prominent experts on various areas of elections and disinformation. We have specialists among my colleagues at IFES and other experts who deal with disinformation on a daily basis. One of the speakers mentioned in the agenda, the IFES Regional Director for Europe and Eurasia, Dr. Beata Martin-Rozumilowicz, unfortunately is unable to join us because of an unexpected other commitment. Beata is one of the authors of the IFES report, Preserving Electoral Integrity During an Infodemic, which was published 16 hours ago. However, one of Beata's co-authors of this report is with us, and that's Lisa Rappel, the IFES Global Social Media and Disinformation Specialist. So this report, Preserving Electoral Integrity During an Infodemic, is part of the IFES COVID-19 briefing series. After Lisa, we will listen to Lukas Andriukaitis, who is Associate Director at the Digital Forensic Research Lab, the Atlantic Council, who will be talking to us about foreign influence campaigns as a vector for the infodemic. The next speaker will be Stewart Jones, Associate and Chief of Staff of the Brunswick Group. She will be addressing building resilience to combat disinformation. And we will hear reflections from Rasto, who is Executive Director of Memo 98, the civil society organization based in Slovakia. His focus today is on tackling the COVID-19 epidemic, how to set up an effective monitoring system. And then we will open for questions to our speakers and for your comments and discussion. And as Nicoletta mentioned, if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat function so that we can all communicate. So first, we will turn to Lisa Rappel from IFES. Lisa, could you tell us a bit about what was the motivation for IFES to put together this brief?
Certainly. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Magnus, thank you for that introduction. So this brief, which as Magnus noted is freshly out in the world, is the third paper in a briefing series that IFES is putting together on COVID-19, looking at the impact of the pandemic on various aspects of electoral processes. And of course, Magnus pointed out the term infodemic, which we are all very familiar with at this point, a term that the World Health Organization coined in February of this year to mark this overabundance of information that makes it difficult to find reliable guidance in this sea of. And this challenge pointed to by the World Health Organization is of course very familiar to a challenge that those of us in the electoral space have been talking about for quite some time. Challenges of information integrity, misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. And so at IFES, with this paper, we wanted to bring these two ideas together to look at the issues of information integrity, and then ask what specifically has changed in this moment due to COVID-19, and what are the implications very specifically on electoral processes. So the campaign period, election administration and operations, the post-electoral period, with a brief commentary on the implications for democratic integrity as a whole. So that is where we started with this paper in terms of the need for it. I'll go ahead and share my screen. I put together a few slides. All right, are my slides fully visible now? Yes, excellent. So as Magnus mentioned, I had the privilege of authoring this, as well as Vasu Mohan, who's our regional director for Asia Pacific. So we're taking a global perspective as we looked at these issues. The core question of the paper: how can information and elections be protected during COVID-19 and other crises? So as we think circulating in the context of COVID-19, that is in combination now with many changes to electoral processes, once very familiar processes that are now being forced to adapt and change, often on short notice. And that creates an environment that has implications for electoral integrity and for public health. And so the core contention of the pain changes to electoral processes to ensure that voters can vote safely, that if we also think about the information space, how can the information space also be defended to ensure that these changes are communicated in a way that ensures that voters feel confident in exercising their right to vote and to participate, that is an equally important consideration. To illustrate the scope of the problem, this is an image from electionguide.org, which is an IFES website that has been tracking election postponements around the world, been postponed or delayed integrity challenges that are taking place at this time. There's different layers or different types of challenges. And I'm so excited to hear from Lukas from the Digital Forensics Research Lab after this, because I know he will have incredible detail on many of these aspects. But as a brief overview of the types of information integrity challenges that we were looking at, thinking about viral misinformation and hate speech. That is circulating already in the information environment. On top of this problematic content that's circulating organically in the information environment, we then talk about different influence operations that are layered on top of that. So we talk about domestic influence operations, and these would be actors, political actors, who are using disinformation about COVID-19 to serve political agendas in the ways that they're messaging to their own citizenry. And we have foreign influence operations as well, notably China, Russia, and others, which Lukas will talk about in his next presentation, if I saw his slide we're talking about. But I also wanted to move more quickly to the analysis and recommendations specific to the electoral process that we look at in this brief. So when it comes to the campaign period, there's an increasing rate at which this trend was already happening of the shift to online campaigning, as options for in-person large gatherings are limited due to restrictions related to public health. The ways in which candidates and campaigns are using online platforms is accelerating, and that is juxtaposed against a recognition that oversight and monitoring of digital campaigns can be limited in many cases. Certainly when we look at legal and regulatory frameworks governing the use of social media in election campaigns, in many of the countries where IFES works, in most of the countries in the world, this framework of thinking about how do we oversee social media in campaigns it has still a lot of questions and a lot of gaps. And so given that there are few public oversight agencies with this capacity, and recognizing that due to this timeline, it might not be feasible for election authorities or oversight bodies to gain the necessary regulatory mandate or make the necessary changes to really build a capacity to monitor from within state institutions. It does also suggest that it's incumbent on civil society and on journalists to be playing a role in monitoring social media to ensure that the worst type of abuses that campaigns and candidates might be engaging in are subject to some degree of oversight. It's also incumbent upon the social media platforms to continue to expand the ad transparency features that are available in some countries, but the vision of tools like the Facebook ad library or Google Ads transparency tools being widely available and globally available is something that we're still waiting to see. And certainly expansions of these tools, particularly Facebook's ad library, which had been planned for many of the countries that might be represented on this call, were delayed due to COVID-19. So it's important that that push continues for the social media companies, because this challenge of ensuring that campaigning online is conducted in ways that are transparent, it gains increasing importance due to the pandemic. In terms of electoral administration and operations, public health considerations have necessitated that election authorities are instituting many changes in the way that elections are conducted. Things like moves to expand mail-in balloting, changes to polling locations, polling procedures, polling hours. These all constitute changes to once familiar electoral processes that voters now must assimilate this information very quickly. And in this environment, there's a lot of opportunities for malign actors, foreign or domestic, to create narratives that are potentially more believable given the general overabundance of information that's available. For example, voter suppression tactics that we've seen integrated into influence campaigns in the past might be more plausible in this information environment. For example, a tactic that we have seen in Russian influence operations around elections in the past is to spread false information about how and where to cast your ballot. For example, text in your ballot or SMS your vote, which might seem slightly more plausible in an environment where you're a voter and you know processes have changed, you're not quite sure how they've changed. So being certain to communicate to voters all the things that they can expect in the ways voting processes and procedures have changed is essential in this environment. There's also the possibility of poll workers themselves becoming a vector for misinformation, particularly if they are required to administer elections and do their job in a way that they've had the limited opportunity to be thoroughly trained on new processes and procedures, which creates the possibility that poll workers themselves might create misinformation, but also creates the possibility that mistakes that are made due to changing procedures can be amplified through the machinery of disinformation operations to create widespread narratives of fraud. In terms of thinking about how to mitigate some of these concerns, proactive communication on the part of election authorities and other electoral stakeholders is essential. Ensuring that voters have an awareness of what to expect throughout the voting process becomes even more significant and of greater importance. Also, as election authorities think about crisis communication planning, this is an essential component of planning and thinking how might election authorities respond in instances where a piece of problematic information about the electoral process does emerge in ways that present a threat to electoral integrity. Crisis communication can include elements such as clarifying internal channels of communication to ensure that election authorities are speaking with a single authoritative voice, but able to respond in a timely manner. It can include coordinating communication strategies with other government agencies to ensure that clarifications that are being issued are not contradictory to one another. It can include elements such as clarifying communication channels with social media platforms to ensure that problematic content that is identified can be removed expeditiously from the platform, particularly if it presents a threat to electoral integrity. The post-electoral period is, as you might suspect, a particularly dangerous time for the issues of misinformation and disinformation. It's during this period after elections when votes have been cast, but the count has begun, perhaps results have not been declared, that there's a degree of uncertainty that is ripe for narratives of fraud that can be deliberately stoked and heightened by actors that have an interest in undermining democratic and electoral integrity. For example, in countries that have not used mail-in balloting before, anticipating the reality that electoral results might not be available until a significant period of time after election day, creating a period of great uncertainty, is something to consider. How can messages be issued and clarified during that time to promote transparency and trust in the process, even during a period of uncertainty? In terms of democratic integrity, we've seen a raft of laws that look to curb misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech, but are crafted in such a way that they present significant challenges for freedoms of expression and freedom of the press. Sometimes these laws are a poorly disguised attempt by a ruling party to consolidate power, but in other instances, they are created out of a recognition that misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech present significant challenges. But the nuance with which you approach legal and regulatory changes can make a big difference in the downstream implications for freedom of expression and freedom of the press. And in instances where there is an attempt to use regulation or codes of conduct to mitigate some of the harms from these challenges, those that look to govern the behavior of domestic rather than criminalizing or sanctioning content might be a more productive avenue to consider. This has been a very quick overview, and I'm looking forward to exploring more of the details in the question and answer session. Before I pass it back to Magnus, I will note that this is the third paper in this COVID-19 briefing series. The first paper covered sort of very practical guidance on how considerations can be taken into account in electoral processes. And the second one looked at these postponements. There's a significant questions that arise when you do that. And this paper looks at how to cope with. And at this point, I will pass the floor back to Magnus.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We will now listen to Lukas Andriukaitis, who is Associate Director at the Digital Forensic Research Lab at the Atlantic Council. Lukas, I understand that your work includes focusing on foreign influence campaigns related to the infodemic. Could you please tell us some more about that?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me share my screen really quick, and without further ado, let's begin. I hope you can hear me well. Today, I'd like to tell you a bit about the disinformation space that was happening throughout the infodemic that started a few months ago, because a lot of these techniques and methods can and will be used in every upcoming election in the foreseeable future. My name is Lukas Andriukaitis. I'm an associate director with the DFR Lab, and for those who do not know who DFR Lab is or what exactly do we do, we identify real time using open source tools and techniques. And in this particular case, when we're working with narratives and specific disinformation methods, we use these tools that we call social media listening tools. They're publicly available and they're usually used for marketing purposes, but they're very, very efficient in finding specific messages and how deep do they spread and how many people do they reach. So using these tools, I would like to go quickly into 3 different countries that were pretty prominent in the infodemic with their disinformation. It's Russia, Iran, and China. And let's start with Russia. I always have the most examples coming from Russia because this is my sort of more academic and professional interest. So and I think they were the most prominent in Europe and United States throughout the pandemic as well. So what did we find? There are 3 main criteria that describe pro-Kremlin disinformation throughout this time. Is that it's offensive, it's opportunistic, and it has very clear goals, which come from a long time before. And they include, for example, dividing the European Union or stoking anti-NATO sentiments or dividing the EU and the US cohesion. So what do I mean by offensive? From the very start of the pandemic, Russia tried to be the source of the virus. For example, let me give you 3 short examples. The first narrative that was being pushed is that the United States is using economic and military tools to pressure competitors, especially China, and one of these military. The second is that the virus was artificially produced in laboratories with the goal of breaking China from within. And the third one is that this is the way that the United States is looking for new biological weapons, and they're testing them in real time, and also, looking for ways to cure it. The second main criteria is opportunism, and it's important to note that when it comes to opportunism, it can be used for foreign influence, but also it can be used for domestic influence. So what do I mean by that? If we're talking about domestic influence, we saw a lot of examples coming from Russian media, and just using every event happening and just turning into their own benefit. So, for example, what they are very good at doing are spinning stories. And when a story that United States Air Force flew 500,000 coronavirus tests from Italy came out in English media, after 2 days it was twisted as if US is, taking away these tests from Italians who are in dire need. Also, recycling stories. What we saw is that some hard left political messages that were originating in Italy were translated word by word, and in a few days appeared on the Russian information. For example, there was this gentleman in Italy who switched European Union flag for a Russian flag as a little video performance. The narrative that appeared afterwards was that all Italians are, we're getting rid of European Union flags. And lastly, what I mean by clear goals, they were using, the coronavirus to achieve the goals that they had for quite some time. For example, when the coronavirus spread out, one of the main narratives was that NATO troops will be the ones that will spread coronavirus throughout Europe. When it comes to China, it's a little bit different. I would like to say that their narratives and techniques are more defensive. They're more aiming to make a positive opinion about themselves, that they're a victim and a savior rather than the cause of the whole problem, and that they're trying to turn Italian society from EU to China. So here's an example from their official embassy in Italy Twitter feed, which looks pretty nice. But I would like to point your attention at this: Forza Cina e Italia, which means let's go, China and Italy. It's like a very positive sort of saying, but what we noticed is that there was a hashtag with exactly the same words, and with this hashtag, very specific messages were being pushed that China, Cuba, Russia, and Albania are the ones that are saving Europe and US, and especially Italy, from the coronavirus by sending help and so on. This was also followed by a lot of negative cartoons towards EU and US and some politicians such as Merkel, and they managed to get 60 million impressions in a scope of a few days, which is really amazing outreach. What we also notice is that 46.3% of all the tweets using came from this hashtag came from bots, and another similar hashtag, which was Grazie Cina, thank you China, had 37% of bots. And we even measured specifically. We noticed that such as the embassy Twitter page had 27.1 fake followers. And for example, spokesperson of China had even close to 60% of fake followers. So this is coming from official level as well. And lastly, very quickly, Iran was not as prominent in this whole thing, but I would also like to say a few things that their disinformation is offensive. And what they tried to do was to blame the United States and Israel for unleashing the virus. And on April 30, Facebook has taken down more than 500 pages and groups, which were very active in disinformation. And we noticed that language-wise, they were targeting Arabic audience. Just what is also very interesting is that when Iran managed to get over some of their coronavirus situation, they just started pushing information that how Trump administration is unable to deal with it and how well Iran is dealing with it. And this, for the very last end, this was my favorite cartoon that they managed to push really far out. And just to quickly sum up, I really like this article, which claims that Russian, Chinese, and Iranian narratives at the end are basically merging together and feeding off each other, which is quite the truth. And I'm looking forward for any questions we might have in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lukas. Very interesting, although I guess also slightly scary information there. I next hand over to Stewart Jones, Associate and Chief of Staff of the Brunswick Group. So, Stewart, how can we build resilience to combat this information?
Thank you. And I believe my presentation should come up in just a moment. Perfect. So yes, as my colleagues here have alluded to, there is a lot of scary disinformation and misinformation as part of this infodemic that we're seeing. Today is how we can start to build resilience to combat disinformation, particularly within the electoral process. For those who aren't familiar, I work at the Brunswick Group, Communications for Business Critical Issues. We have 24 offices around the world, and I work on our cybersecurity and data privacy practice, which has given us a front row in the last 10 years. So along the same lines, we built out a disinformation offer to help all types of organizations build resilience, dive into how electoral stakeholders can build resilience, and particularly as many of the elections are being postponed and rescheduled amidst the ongoing infodemic. Next slide. So in today's dynamic political and data-driven environment, every election official should assume that you will need to respond to at least one disinformation incident at some point. Of course, the chances of this are further heightened during the pandemic. I believe that communications will be your primary presentation today. Will be spent focusing on why the planning around the communications piece is so important. There's a famous quote, "Plans are useless, but planning is," and often find that the planning before an incident will make sure is really what illuminates the most helps occur. Next slide. Before I go any further, and some of my colleagues have touched on this, I did just want to quickly define misinformation. In this case, I'll be using the term misinformation to describe false or inaccurate information spread unintentionally, information spread in order to deceive. Next slide. So as we look ahead to upcoming elections this year, particularly with the sophistication and more diverse threat actors than ever before, Lisa and Lukas spoke about this in their presentations as well. Presidential election is that disinformation campaigns will often use real news from existing sources. However, this news will often be taken. In these cases, casting suspicion on the integrity of the electoral process is just as effective, as even trickier. Further, studies are showing that although people can typically identify when a news article is real, there is a degree of partisanship that exists here. People are more likely to believe disinformation if it aligns with their political ideology. We are used to push out disinformation about elections. We are seeing memes on Reddit and 4chan, videos on YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, and Facebook, which often includes links. These factors make it even more critical to be prepared up front. Building that resilience is your best chance of surviving disinformation. Next slide. A few goals that should be kept in mind for election officials as you think about how to counter disinformation. The first is to really understand your audience. He has identified the audiences most susceptible to disinformation based on the experience in 2016. People in rural areas and people with low levels of media literacy. You will need to do the same type of assessment within your context and based on your experience. The group that I like to call the persuadables. By this, I mean the individuals that are closer to the middle of the spectrum, who may be influenced by disinformation, persuaded to change their opinion if new information was presented. This brings me to the second goal, building the resilience in advance. Once you educate them ahead of an incident to build that trust. Additionally, you should identify not just this group, but also the group I like to call validator. Validator as an external individual, group, or organization that can help provide accurate information to counter disinformation during an incident. For example, a local advocacy group could be an excellent validator, working together with that group that all force your messaging about the electoral process. The third and fourth goals on this slide are really focused on putting pen to paper in your planning. Going through the exercise of scenario planning, you will be able to more successfully respond to an incident when it does occur and ensure that you are able to preserve public trust. Next slide. And I believe that developing a playbook is a very good way to do that. The process of developing the playbook is really as important as the document itself because it forces you and your team to begin thinking about how to anticipate the most likely threats and helps you view the opportunity to develop effective messaging before an incident occurs. In this case, a playbook specifically focused on how to counter steps to build resilience by establishing yourself as a credible source ahead of time. Key processes through the scenarios most likely to occur, and game out possible incidents with your new playbook plan in mind. Next slide. So I'm talking a lot about building resilience, and I want to go a little bit deeper on what I mean by this. To withstand disinformation narratives, and election commissions should play a proactive role in ensuring the public knows what you stand for, what your values are, and how you operate. For example, I live in Washington, D.C. We were also under a curfew due to the ongoing protests taking place in the city. As a result, there was a lot of dis and misinformation being certain whether voters would be penalized for being out past curfew, even though the limited poll locations due to COVID-19 made for a multi-hour wait for most voters. Strong online communities ahead of time, they were able to continuously provide updates throughout the day with the factual information, which then helped to eliminate false information that had been shared. Certainly, this means more effort up front, but information incident. I've also included a screenshot on this slide of a tweet from a county auditor Twitter account. As an example, seen as a source of trustworthy and factual information will help establish that credibility up front. Next slide. Every mis or disinformation scenario is different and certainly requires creative thinking to counteract. Are dealing with communicating about disinformation that have emerged over time and that I've included here on this slide. A couple that I'd like to highlight in more detail to the public or to your stakeholders about a mis or disinformation incident. Avoid repeating that rebuttal by repeating the false allegation or rumor. You can inadvertently reinforce the myth in the mind of your audience. Instead, focus your communication to false messages. Additionally, establish that verified voice. Use your social media platforms to regularly point out. Establish your channels as the go-to sites for that accurate information so that media, voters will go there first. Next slide. The best disinformation is based on some element of truth you may have, because those vulnerabilities can be used to more accurately predict some of the disinformation themes that may be used against your electoral system. The goal is to uphold your country's political system. These attacks often seize onto existing and sometimes legitimate critiques of the system and enrage skeptics. On this slide, I've included some of the key themes that we've been seeing in disinformation about elections. Of course, add to this list. One of the key points that I want to communicate today is that although these are prevalent themes that we've seen, it's very important to spend the time thinking honestly about the likely themes, what allow you to develop more realistic scenarios in a planning playbook and spend time brainstorming your communications response before the disinformation hits. Off guard when disinformation about an election begins to circulate. Next slide. Getting a bit more tactical here, I wanted to highlight some of the key materials that I would recommend that you consider to develop the critical components of your disinformation playbook. Of course, it's impossible to predict the exact disinformation that will disrupt an election, but going through the exercise of doing this, you have to tailor your messages and response plan rather than start from scratch. Perhaps most critical is to build out some key messages that are pre-approved. That way, you are able to respond quickly during an incident and you can respond. Once you've drafted key messages, it will be easier to use those as the foundation for other communications that you could draft in advance, including a holding statement, Q&A, talking points, a tweet or Facebook post, etc. Next slide. Of course, I realize that we've just skimmed the surface here, but hopefully this provides a helpful overview of some of the work that can be done upfront to build the resilience to combat disinformation and its threat to electoral integrity. Next slide. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions that you may have during the Q&A.
Many very practical recommendations and tips there. Thank you for that. So we will now listen to reflections by Rasto Kužel from Memo 98 in Slovakia. Rasto, tell us, how can concerned actors set up an effective monitoring system to tackle the COVID-19 infodemic?
Well, thank you very much, Magnus. It's an honor to be here and to share I hope, practical experience in this field. Maybe at the beginning, I would like to say that I represent Memo 98, and we have some 2 decades of experience in monitoring media prior to elections. We have worked in about 56 countries, and our focus has been mainly on how traditional media cover elections. But about 5 years ago, around 2016, we could not simply ignore the social media anymore. So we started monitoring social media. But today, what I would like to share with you is actually more related to how we use, how we have used other methodology to set up COVID-19 disinformation monitoring. So if I can ask for my presentation to be put on the screen. Perfect. Basically, the first case of COVID-19 was reported on the 6th of March in Slovakia. And, you know, obviously many people started volunteering. If I can get the next slide, please. And my wife is very good in sewing. So this was the way how she approached this issue, and she started to sew masks for the House of Seniors, which is located in I mean, not very far from us. If I can get the next slide, please. And this is an example of one of these seniors, you know, wearing the mask. It's myself, and I'm not very good in sewing. So me and my colleagues, we started to think how we can be actually helpful, how we can use our monitoring tools, you know, to help in that situation. And so what we came up with was basically that, you know, we can actually volunteer, and we can use our time, and we decided to help our health ministry in setting up the monitoring system, and we used CrowdAngle, which I also saw that Lukas presented on his slides, and we set it up in a way to catch the COVID-19 related misinformation and disinformation. If I can get the next slide, please. So before I go to that, let me just briefly describe the methodological approach. So as I mentioned before, primarily, the methodology is designed for election-related disinformation. If I can get the next slide, please. And so prior to any monitoring, there are basically a few things that we have to consider. So to date, we have done monitoring of social media in about 6 different countries, and mostly, as I mentioned, related to elections. So the first one was last year was Nigeria. And so prior to this activity, we always try to do some mapping of media and social media landscape. Another very important consideration is, of course, to be clear about you know, how much resources we have, and of course how many people we have for this monitoring. What proves to be extremely important part of this monitoring is actually the type of tools. And here, if I make a comparison to traditional media monitoring, over there the situation is rather very easy and very clear. I mean, you have to have access to archives of television. You have to have access to archives of online media. But that's pretty much, I mean, it's rather very clear, you know, when you are focusing on a prime time, all you need to have is the ability, you know, to have access to the archive. When it comes to social media monitoring, is very different because obviously we are dealing with huge amounts of data, and that's why it's crucial to have tools which give you access to this data. And that is really sometimes problematic when it comes to different platforms. So we know that after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook has been you know, rather restrictive when it comes to access to API. But those who have access to CrowdAngle, you know, you have access to historic data. and this is extremely important for researchers. And so this is what I would like to show you today, just very briefly, how we use CrowdAngle for different types of monitoring. The last point, obviously, is that you have to, or you want to link your monitoring to some laws and regulations. Again, when it comes to traditional media, there are international standards, there are laws which regulate the public, the private media. But as you know, the legislation when it comes to social media has been only developing. And we have had very interesting webinars recently on a Digital Services Act, on the audiovisual media services directive, which will be coming into effect as of September this year. So, but it's still pretty much in the making. Next slide, please. So when it comes to social media monitoring, basically there are 4 different phases that we, in a way, recognize under our methodology. The first phase is defining the scope, meaning like how many platforms you will focus on. The next stage is actually when you scrape the data and when you code the data. The third phase is when you do the actual analysis of this data, and the last phase is when you report on this data. The next slide, please. So what do we focus on? When it comes to election-related monitoring, we focus on what we call messenger. So this is the source of information. So here, obviously, we are focusing on electoral contestants. We are also focusing on a category of social media influencers. We are focusing on traditional media, social media accounts. And so there are like 4 main categories of our focus. The second area deals with the actual message itself. And this is pretty much what we focused on in relation to COVID-19 monitoring. And the last part is actually how the message is amplified. So, you know, are the actors using, you know, artificial ways of amplification? Are they using bots or trolls? So how does the message spread? The next slide, please. So when it comes to the message, here we are using our content analysis, which we have developed over these 20 years of monitoring. And so we are focusing on different types of topics, subtopics, and narratives. And in connection with COVID-19, we actually focused also on some keywords. So we came up with a system of clusters of how we define the keywords of our research. The next slide, please. Yes, and so basically, this is what I meant by amplification of the message. So focusing on whether the message is actually amplified, whether it's supported by trolls and bots, and to what extent, what sort of impressions, what sort of interactions does this message receive? The next slide, please. So now let me go more specifically into this COVID-19 disinformation. So here, maybe I will ask Nikki to stop sharing this, you know, this presentation, and I would like to show you more specifically on how we use the CrowdAngle for our monitoring. So first of all, there is a very useful feature that CrowdAngle built for the COVID-19 or prior, you know, to the actual emergence of this pandemic. And this is a new feature, which is a search feature. And so you could basically take any sort of information, any article, and you could just copy it to this new search function, and it will basically give you lots of useful information. So it will first of all give you information about where these this particular article or this post, where was it posted? So, for example, this one that I'm now showing you is a quite popular disinformation which was spread by this Italian Forza Italia member of parliament, who was questioning the actual results. He was actually questioning that there were so many casualties in Italy in result of COVID-19. He said that around 25,000 people died, but not all of them in the result of the coronavirus. And in the Slovak context, I mean, this was shared by a number of these disinformation websites. And so here, with this, you can actually go very specifically and see where this was shared. I should say that CrowdTangle allows you to actually get the data from public profiles. It does not allow you to basically go into private profiles, but here you get also the number of interactions also from private profiles. So that's the first thing that I think is very, very useful. And just very briefly, let me go back to our dashboard. And just very briefly, I want to show you what did we do, in terms of using the CrowdTangle for this COVID-19 related disinformation. So first of all, in our dashboard, we created a list of Facebook pages which have a reputation of circulating disinformation. Now, unlike during elections, here we also included disinformation and particular misinformation, which is spread by some health pages, who basically tell you nonsense, such as you can cure the cancer with baking soda, for example. And so we ended up putting together like 111 Facebook pages. Now, here you can actually, CrowdTangle allows you to set the period, for example, last 7 days. You can basically set whether you want to see all posts, or you are interested in photos, links, statuses, videos. So basically here you can set up the post that you are interested in, and here you can just set the system to overperforming posts, underperforming. You can set it to total interactions that these posts basically get. And so here, basically, you have the information, from these disinformation websites. So what we did, we actually used this notification function, where you can set up viral alerts, you can set up referral alerts, and this is excellent system because it sort of, you can include your email address, and you will be receiving emails and notifications in real time about any type of disinformation which is there, and about the disinformation which is getting viral status, so which basically performs very well, and of course here you can really set the system to to whatever number of interactions you wish, and this way you will be receiving these notifications in real time. So in comparison with electoral disinformation, again, we included a lot of different keywords. We have 277 different keywords, which relate to health issues, which relate to China, to Russia. And this information was then forwarded to an organization which was then doing the debunking. And it included, obviously, health experts from the Slovak Health Ministry. And so this way, we were able actually to debunk, the disinformation which was spread, or misinformation related to, using different drugs, such as ibuprofen, and that way being prevented from getting COVID-19, which obviously proved to be disinformation. So maybe I will stop it here, and again, we'll be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Magnus, you are muted.
I apologize for that. Thank you very much, Rasto, and thank you to all our speakers who have addressed the issue of disinformation in a pandemic related to elections from very different angles. So we will now be opening up to all the participants. If you have questions to our speakers, if you have points that you would like to make, please use the chat function to type that in. And while you are typing away, I will mention some questions that have already been sent in by participants. I have one first for Lukas, which is, would you say that there's been a quantifiably significant increase in Russian disinformation activity around COVID-19, or is it more business as usual? What would be your take on that?
That's actually a very good question, and I would argue that when it comes to scope, maybe there wasn't a significant increase, but what we noticed is that there was a sort of mustering of resources and just pushing it, on this topic specifically. It's really hard to measure, the overall scope of how many disinformation attacks might have there been. But what we know is that all of the narratives that have been there before the crisis sort of slowly die down a little bit. They just are more opportunistic on the events that are happening, and quickly and maybe a bit more nimble to respond to what is happening, and they're just trying to be more opportunistic.
Okay. Thank you very much.
To add to that, I would also say, Lukas, very much in that same vein when we were looking at Russian disinformation, that it almost seems like COVID is a new tactic that's part of the exact same agenda that was being played out. So in terms of discrediting electoral processes, discrediting democracy and the capacity to respond to COVID-19, that it's very much in that opportunistic use of a new tactic in service of the same agenda.
Thank you very much for that, Lisa. And I actually had a question from the audience for you as well. One point is regarding social media companies. From the research that's being done, what would be the practical recommendations on what social media companies can do to stop intentional disinformation in relation to election campaigns? What are they not doing so far that they should do, or what are they not doing enough that they should be doing more?
Right. I mean, I think particular moment, there are a few recommendations that would carry particular weight. It is worth acknowledging that as much work as the platforms still have to do, the infrastructure that was put in place at platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and others, when COVID-19 struck, there was this use this infrastructure for reacting to misinformation and disinformation and direct that attention towards COVID-19. But that comes with its own set of problems, namely when it comes to the content moderation capacities that were already in place. As COVID-19 was prioritized, we found that the platform's capacity to be monitoring other content that's in violation of their community standards, such as electoral interference or hate speech, has actually been limited somewhat, as content moderators have been sort of sent home to work remotely, and this workload was redistributed across their remote workforce. And that, in the moment when elections were being postponed, made complete sense. But this intersection of challenges is such that it is now necessary that the platforms continue to ramp up their other prior existing content moderation capacities. Also, delays in the expansion of ad transparency tools that, again, understandable perhaps that those rollouts were delayed due to COVID-19, but given the shift to online campaigning, it's more important than ever that this ad transparency tools are expanded as well. Another piece in terms of concrete recommendations, something that Facebook and perhaps the platforms will follow in their steps have recently done, is labeling state media linked pages on the platform as being sort of linked to their government entity, and plans in the US to ban the ability these pages to run paid political advertising during US election. And I think that limitation on the ability of clearly partisan foreign actors to pay to promote propaganda to democratic audiences is a feature that should be expanded globally, certainly. There's also some considerations around how the platforms are defining their definitions of electoral interference, and are those being arrived at and defined in ways that are inclusive and take into account differences in global perspective. So for example, IFES, through the Design for Democracy Coalition, which is a group of international actors and local partners, to bridge that communication divide between the platforms and local actors, so that it's not simply a group of individuals in Silicon Valley arriving at definitions of what electoral interference or hate speech is or is not allowed. I'm sure there are many other perspectives on this question. There's no shortage of opinions about what the platform should be doing. I welcome other perspectives from speakers or participants as well, but those are a few thoughts.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And we have more questions, but I would really like to hear from the other speakers on this issue as well. And Rasto has his virtual hand up. Please, Rasto.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I just wanted to echo what Lisa said. And basically, I think we have learned basically from this COVID-19 crisis that some things that these platforms previously said were not possible were actually possible. I mean, when it comes to dealing with disinformation. So I think this was in a way, I would say, positive development that they were able to deal with this kind of information in a different manner. They still maintain that obviously when it comes to election-related disinformation, that it is a much more general and wider topic, and it's much easier for them to actually deal with illegal content than with this type of content. I mean, which is open for different interpretations, and obviously we don't want them to to start taking down content which which is not really illegal. But clearly, I wanted to just make that point that we saw that things that they had claimed previously was not possible to deal with, to take down some content. I mean, they proved during this crisis that it was actually possible. But I also agree with the point Lisa made on the number of these content moderators. Obviously, I mean, for example, with Facebook, with 2.8 billion of users, I mean, it's not enough to have one fact checker for about 70,000 users.
Thank you very much, Rasto. Lukas and Stewart, would you like to weigh in on the issue of social media companies and what they should be doing?
Sure. I think, yeah, we're actually thinking a lot about this in our organization. How should the media companies approach this? And I might be sounding a bit naive or optimistic, but I think they are doing more and more on this. Except some of the non-Western media outlets, and I think we should always focus our attention on that. What I have from my experience, what is happening on Vkontakte or Odnoklassniki or other Russian media outlets is quite terrifying, because when you go from Facebook to there, it feels like a different reality, because there's no actual control, and there's actually no interest to even controlling what is going on there. And there are bots, trolls, whatever you want. There's stolen content. There's even pornography, like anything that you might imagine is going on Vkontakte, and there's no interest from their side to even control it. And it's being used in many ways. It's being used a bit of a Trojan horse, and some countries have managed to take care of this problem a bit better. I think Ukraine is a good example. They haven't. They just banned it and then forgot about it. And I think if we're not going to look for a better solution than that, I think we should maybe consider about it in the Western world as well.
Thank you very much, Lukas. Stewart, I have two questions for you though come in from the audience, and then if you want to respond to this question as well. But apart from the social media companies, you said in your presentation that if you start when you are responding to disinformation by repeating the false information, you risk spreading it even further. So how do we know when we actually should respond to disinformation? That's one question. Another question that come in is, you did talk about persuadables in your presentation. Do you have a sense that the body of persuadables has been impacted by the current pandemic? Is it a different type of body? Is it a different body now than it was before? And how do we think about it? So, sorry, 3 questions into one, please.
No problem. So I'll start by addressing the question about when to address disinformation, because it's certainly not always straightforward. I think there are a number of questions that you should consider when you're deciding whether it makes sense to respond. Is the disinformation believable? You know, is it effective, and in terms of clickbait? You know, is it salacious and interesting? Is it likely going to attract people because of the salacious nature of the disinformation? And perhaps also most critically, is it likely, if it picks up steam, likely to do damage to the electoral process? And, you know, all disinformation is going to fall across a believability spectrum. And one of the recommendations I would make is to develop an escalation protocol that you and your team can use when you are determining whether it makes sense to respond to disinformation. And if the answer to some of those questions is yes, then it probably falls more in the high severity column of your protocol and warrants a response. And just to get very tactical, I like to think about the communication response as kind of what I call like a truth sandwich. So you want to start with the facts, do not repeat the misinformation, provide additional information about where to find more information that is factual, whether that's a link or, you know, directing someone to a different Twitter account or website or blog, and then repeat the fact in a different or you know, repetitive way, just to make sure that your audience has that information. And it's sometimes easier said than done. So starting to draft that in advance and think about what you would want to say, depending on where the disinformation falls on the spectrum, is a useful exercise. And I'll also just mention that it's typically easier to scale back an initial, you know, overreaction rather than catch up if you've insufficiently responded and the disinformation has started to spread and become more mainstream. And then in terms of the second question about persuadables, really interesting, and probably, frankly, it depends on the context in which you're looking. But I will say, and many of my colleagues have touched on this throughout, but just given the influx of information in this infodemic, I would say people, generally speaking, are more wary of all of the information they're receiving, but they're also becoming far more educated. And I'm particularly thinking of children right now who are maybe teenagers or even in the middle school age group, whom are being taught about how to determine what's real online in their coursework at school. And so in that regard, I actually think we are typically raising a generation that is more digitally literate, which will help in starting to continue to combat disinformation. And I think my colleagues really thoroughly addressed the question about social media. The one thing I would add is that as you think about combating disinformation, it could be worth investing in or utilizing a free early warning tool. Once you've identified what you think the key themes might be related to disinformation in your election process, you can populate those tools with you know, the right search strings and start to collect that disinformation early. And that will allow you to really look at the spectrum on the escalation protocol and make those choices as early as possible. And frankly, it might also allow you the opportunity to contact the social media company and report disinformation if you are fearful about its continuing to catch fire.
Thank you very much, Stewart. And thank you for addressing the issue of critical thinking among children when it comes to disinformation. That's something I think about personally every day with my own children. Rasto, we had a question coming in from you as well. You showed us very interesting use of CrowdTangle, which evidently seems to be a very interesting tool. Could you say a few words about when you've been using this, what have the key findings been? What have been some of the conclusions from your work in using this CrowdTangle tool?
Thank you very much for that question. And actually, when I was now listening to Stewart, it just came to my mind that from the perspective of EMBs, particularly, of course, we are talking about, in a way, building this type of disinformation, which usually happens through these attempts to undermine the trust of EMBs. And I think CrowdTangle could really be used as a tool. I mean, if you identify this type of divisive narratives in advance, or if you identify these sort of narratives which are trying to undermine the reputation of an EMB, and you set up the system, because this is the great thing about CrowdTangle that is so powerful, that it allows, I mean, an EMB basically, of course, you need to understand how CrowdTangle works, but then it takes no more than one person who can set up the whole system, and it sort of would alert you once these type of narratives are being spread. Obviously, for this you need to know, from where this type of information could be coming. So that's one thing to remember. The second thing to remember is that we are talking about public pages. So CrowdTangle does not allow you to get the data from private, private profiles, private accounts. So we are talking about, and of course, you could argue that this type of disinformation is also very frequently spread by private groups, private accounts. So for that, you wouldn't be able to use CrowdTangle. But for this, again, just building up on this idea that this could be something that an EMB could use. Once, of course, you have to be onboarded to CrowdTangle, but then you could actually do this monitoring yourself. So you would be able to set up the system of early alert. You would be able, particularly, set up the system of these referral alerts, which would include keywords, trying again to undermine the reputation of an EMB, which then, of course, these actors use consequently after the election results are announced to say, look, this electoral management body is not unbiased. They try to please a particular party. So again, maybe I'm not responding directly to a question how we have used it, but I'm just sort of elaborating on how it could be used by other colleagues, who are on this call, so that they don't feel that this is something, super difficult. I mean, it's actually a very user-friendly system. I should state that it's not very easy at the moment to be onboarded to CrowdTangle. So obviously you have to, it's a process. For us, it took 3 months, basically. And the reason is that, as I mentioned, after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Facebook is more careful about sharing the access to API. But this is exactly why they acquired CrowdTangle in 2017. And CrowdTangle now has been, sort of access to CrowdTangle has been shared also with groups like us and many others. And so I think Facebook is very much sort of cooperating with state institutions. So I think in that framework, I probably see the potential that some of our colleagues from EMBs could actually try to see if they could be onboarded. But then once they are onboarded, I really highly recommend this, because it could be really used at your benefit.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So to jump on that, I love this idea train, because now I'm thinking about applications on that front as well. And it's my understanding that Facebook has some hesitancy to allow government agencies and actors such as EMBs direct access to CrowdTangle. But there's also functionality that, in partnership with a civil society organization that does have access, or with an international assistance provider such as IFES or a similar organization that does have access to CrowdTangle, to set up viral alerts or dashboards that can be sent to an external actor. So it's actually an interesting place where that can be done in partnership, even if an entity might not have direct access to the tool themselves. So I'm interested in this idea.
Precisely. Let me just make a very quick point. I mean, this is exactly what we did with our work for the Slovak Ministry of Health. So we got access. I mean, we are using CrowdTangle and Newsweep, which is another useful tool, I mean, for CrowdTangle, you can actually monitor Facebook, you can monitor Reddit, and you can monitor Instagram. But Newsweep allows you to sort of enlarge the monitoring also to YouTube and to websites. But you can set up these sort of alerts on both systems, and then you can actually send it to people at administration, and this way avoid this sort of hesitance, as you mentioned, by Facebook to actually give the full access to a state institution.
Thank you very much, Rasto. We are coming towards the end of the webinar. Lukas, Stewart, do you have any final words you want to share with us?
I'll just add that it's been a real pleasure to get to talk with all of you this morning, and I certainly welcome additional dialogue in this space. I think it's completely necessary and great to see so many people coming together to work through these complex challenges.
Yeah, me too. I'm very happy to have an opportunity to share some of my thoughts and work. And I guess, again, what I learned from this webinar is that disinformation is not going anywhere. And if we learned something from the pandemic, is that it might even get a little stronger. So all of us will have more work in the near.
Thank you very much. Well, we will then wrap up this webinar. I want to thank all of our speakers. I want to thank all of you for participating. I again want to thank USAID for supporting this event, and Nicoletta Diosci for the technical preparation and management. The next installment in this webinar series will be announced soon, both the exact date and the specific topic. But until then, I want to thank you all again and stay safe.